So for the next 50 minutes, we are going to hear from 3 really brilliant practitioners, each working in incredibly different contexts, but all wrestling with similar big questions: how communities like this can organize themselves, change, grow, and most importantly, sustain impact. That's what we're trying to do. So as you listen to these 3 individuals, I encourage you to reflect on what they're saying and sharing from their experience that overlaps with what we're trying to do for us in the lab. So let me first of all, I'm going to introduce them, and then I'll invite them to join me on stage. At the front of the room. It's a stage. Okay. So first I'll introduce Martha Dillon. Martha is the Senior Technical Manager for Climate Mitigation at C40 Cities, which is a global network of over 100 mayors leading on climate action. And in her role, Martha helps cities develop climate action plans and evidence. She brings deep experience in city policy, housing, and the built environment. She is an engineer and writer and contributes regularly on climate and design in the Architectural Review. Relevant to us, the C40 community is a movement. It's global, and with what it calls a network of climate leaders. So each member city, so each of those mayors represents a member city and must meet C40 leadership standards. Their 2 main missions are to help wean the world off fossil fuels by 2030 and address the impacts and injustices of climate breakdown. Next on our panel will be Kat Scott. Kat is an architect and campaigner, and she's currently with the Hackney Council as Sustainability and Climate Change Officer. Kat advises on planning applications and policy and has led on regenerative design. She's been an active voice in networks such as LETI, ACAN, and Architects Declare, and is passionate about how grassroots activism and professional practice can work hand in hand. For this conversation, we're going to ask Kat to put on her ACAN hat. Of course, she'll be welcome to pop her other hats on, change costumes where relevant. ACAN, which is Architects Climate Action Network, is a community benefit society, a people-powered movement. Members receive newsletters, have voting rights, can attend events, and help steer the direction of the organization. It has also thematic groups, so much like our task and finish groups, focusing on different topics such as ecology and biodiversity, to policy and urbanism. It also has coordinators who shape and deliver on ACAN's campaign and events. Finally, we're joined by Dee Halligan, who is founding director of Forth. Forth is a creative lab experimenting with how people connect with ideas and skills in a changing world. Dee has developed award-winning programs such as Firsthand, Maker Library Network, and FixCamp, which is funded by major European and UK bodies. Dee's work is rooted in place, learning, and community connection, rethinking how we equip people for the challenges ahead. We're going to be asking Dee to put on her Firsthand hat. She too can change hats if she likes. Firsthand is one of 9 EU Horizon-funded exploratory projects with partners including UCL Climate Action Unit and Trinity College Dublin. It was created by Forth, which is a community interest company with nonprofit roots. Forth has created a framework for a learning ecosystem or community of practice in which a group regularly meets to share, learn, and work through challenges and opportunities around shared interests, such as cross-sectoral collaborations for learning and scaling green skills. So from those intros, I know that you'll see a lot of resonance with what we're trying to do with the Systems Change Lab. So please join me in welcoming our panelists up here at the front of the room. Thanks all. And just so we're really excited to hear your experiences working in, building, or sustaining communities for change. So that can include not only the benefits of this, but also the pitfalls and challenges, unexpected opportunities, or gear shifts that you have to make along the way. After we ask an initial question to each of them, we're going to open the floor to your questions. So as you listen, please do think about what resonates most for you, for your perhaps task and finish group, or for the Systems Change Lab as a whole. Especially note down anything you might find relevant for our model of how we want the lab to be in the future. So, all right, so I will open with a broad question to anyone here. You've each been part of communities that bring people together to make change, whether that's at the local level or more global networks. I'm curious to hear from each of you what first drew you into this kind of work and what keeps you motivated. And any of you are welcome to begin.
I guess I can begin. Is it working? It's on. What drew me into working in networks? I mean, I think something we spoke about when we met before this was how we all feel we work in lots of different networks and lots of different levels. So I guess for me, I am always thinking about kind of what level of the system's layers really works. There's not an obvious answer that anyone has drawn me to it because I feel connected, wanting to connect or need to connect all of them. I guess with cities specifically, I grew up in London, and for most of my kind of teenage adult life, we had a Labour mayor and a Tory government. So it always felt very obvious to me that mayors could be and cities could be sites for alternative political figures to form, whether you particularly love them or not. It was an alternative political figure. And so it felt like a really interesting place where if a national government isn't representing your views, maybe a local government or a local political figure could amass a bit of energy behind them. And I guess I increasingly work internationally on cities because that is being replicated the world over. You know, America, really good case in point where there are cities doing incredible things against a backdrop of a national government that maybe aren't so aligned with it. So that's why I'm interested in the city space. I think the other reason cities are interesting is that they both point up and point down. They can speak to national government policy, but also, you know, a city only functions if it genuinely represents people to a local level, and I'm sure Kat can speak to this at the council level. You know, cities have responsibilities for operations that affect people's day-to-day lives, which have huge climate consequences. So yeah, what keeps me motivated? I guess not a particularly positive answer, but you don't really have the luxury not to remain motivated, I think. And I know there are lots of people who say it's a luxury even to be kind of sad about it, but I guess I sit somewhere in the middle of feeling kind of like you have to do it, but also recognising that, you know, there's lots of good stuff happening too.
Thank you.
Kat or Dee?
But just in case.
Turn it on. There we go. Who'd like to go next?
Hi. Oh, yes. You can hear me now. So I guess my background is I trained as an architect, and I worked initially in exhibition, commercial exhibition initially, and then when the penny dropped that all of my creative effort was going into selling cars and trainers, I sidestepped to museums and cultural institutions and sectoral organisations. And I guess the connection for me was always what's next. You know, once you do the exhibition, once you do the talk, once you do the program, and I guess this happens as a designer often, you do the thing and then you think, well, what's the impact of the thing and how might this connect with other efforts to be more interesting or more available or more worthwhile? And I think that's what probably drew me first into thinking, well, why are we building an exhibition here when everyone's there? Or why are we talking about this here when it's only to the same people? So you have to think, well, what would help me, you know, engage those different people? And those skills build up, I guess, over time, where instead of saying, yes, let's design the exhibition, you say, why is it an exhibition? And then often you're into, is it a relationship of some kind? Does it have duration? Should it be some other media, for example? And I guess that's what made me really annoying in meetings, but potentially really useful at this point when you've done it 100 times and made all those mistakes.
I suppose for me, what drew me to climate advocacy type work was initially a sense of like complacency and naivety on my part, that I thought that having been taught my whole life that climate change was real and that there were solutions to address it, including many of which were in the built environment, I just simply assumed that the powers to be would be doing something about it. And I enjoyed studying my undergraduate architecture degree,
doing really lovely hand drawings and mucking around, making interesting forms, and not really thinking too much about all of this, because we were taught at the University of Nottingham all about passive house and all about environmental design, best practice. We had really expert lecturers, because the University of Nottingham is very good for environmental design. So I sort of thought, oh, it's sorted, you know. And then it was, 2018, and it quickly became apparent through reading the IPCC reports that year, and through my master's degree, actually, I was doing quite a lot of exploration into the Anthropocene, which right then felt like a really, no one knew what that word meant. It was so impressive to be talking about. Now everyone knows what that word means. But I was looking a lot into the kind of outcome of, I suppose, capitalism and the mass production of stuff, and where's all this stuff going to go, and also nuclear waste, and where's that going to go, and becoming really deeply concerned about the made material impact of man on Earth. I say man quite deliberately. I suppose something clicked where I was like, no one is really doing enough about this, and I could help. And at that point, a group, Letty, cropped up into my peripheral vision and seemed like an opportunity that I could get involved. They were advertising for people to become involved, so I just became involved. And then through that, I became involved in ACAN, and all quite organically blew up, basically, for me. And similarly to what Martha said, I feel like what keeps me motivated is that it's really necessary work. I have a real belief that we can, as a society, do something about this. I think we can really do a lot to reduce climate risks. I think there's a certain inevitability about some of it now, but I think there's a huge amount that we can still do collectively. But also what keeps me motivated day to day is things like reading really scary news articles and scientific papers, then looking at my daughter and thinking about what future does she have, but then also spending time in gardens and trying to grow food, and seeing how increasingly impossible that's becoming where I live in North Essex. And I live somewhere that, sometimes you read like climate scientists live on like hilltops in like really clever places where they could thrive in a climate like really worst case scenario. I don't live like that. I live on an estuary in North Essex, which is both in drought and at flooding risk at the same time. So personally quite sweating about my life choices there as well.
Thanks. So what's really interesting about your responses, I saw some similarities there. One thing was your inclination to be asking questions all the time about what you were doing and what was happening around you. You all spoke about networks of networks and sort of being able to tap into those things, leverage points, and seizing opportunities when they're coming across, and also that intrinsic motivation and beliefs that was you're feeling something quite keenly. Kat, I want to stick with you for a moment and talk about ACAN, if that's all right. So ACAN has a really grassroots sort of people-powered structure, thematic groups, coordinators. What are the advantages, as you have seen it, of this approach and the trade-offs of such an informal kind of member-led organization?
Yeah, so ACAN started very informally through kind of word of mouth. It essentially started in the kind of Extinction Rebellion first protests in London, where a couple of architects ran into each other, were talking and said, we need to do something about this within architecture. I think Architects Declare started at basically the same time. So Architects Declare was practices who had won the Sterling Prize, of which I worked for one, at that point declaring a climate emergency and a manifesto. So there's about 20 practices initially. That's now got more than 1,000 architecture practices in the UK, and it has ballooned to become Built Environment Declares, an international organisation which includes engineers. Many of your companies probably are signed up to it, and other professions in the built environment. So that was very like professional led. Yeah. That was companies declaring a climate emergency and setting out what they were going to do as businesses. However, I suppose ACAN was the opposite in that it was individuals coming together around common concerns and interest to make change happen. So we're not necessarily representing their organisations, and so we're maybe able to act with a little bit more agency in terms of the things that they said and did, because they weren't tied to any particular business plan and it started in this quite organic way initially, where there was a small group of people, about 10 or 12, meeting on regular intervals at the Barbican in the free kind of open area seating part, eating hummus and like trying to formulate what would be the structure of this organisation and what would be the priorities. And over a series of many months, we kind of came to coalesce around a few priorities, which were decarbonise now. We had so much debate about decarbonise when, should it be by 2030, should it be by 2050, what should it be, what do we mean? And then someone said now, and it was like, oh fab, that's great. Ecological regeneration and cultural transformation. So everything ties back to those three, and still now that's what is the basis of ACAN. And then there's, as you mentioned earlier, all these different thematic groups which then support those aims. They might tie into one or two or three of them. And those groups, I suppose, because it was founded off the back of an Extinction Rebellion, some of the members were very involved in Extinction Rebellion. One of them has been arrested for Extinction Rebellion, and we did a whole thing about Save Tom Bennett and his architectural status. Anyway, as a result, it kind of takes the structural organisation inspiration from XR, so it's kind of a holacracy, it's very decentralised, or it tries to be as decentralised as possible as an organisation can be. There is an inevitable level of organisation requirement for some form of hierarchy. There is a steering group. There are people who are now paid to do work through funding. I don't actively participate as a steering group member or whatnot now, but I was a coordinator for one of the groups, thematic groups. So I don't know if that answers your question, but essentially the kind of, in terms of the benefits, trade-offs and whatnot, the benefits of ACAN were, and still are, I think, that it gives ability for people who maybe work for organisations that are not very ambitious in climate terms or don't have capacity to be ambitious to come together. It also is a really great informal knowledge transfer network. There's WhatsApp groups for each of the groups, and there's constant sharing of resources. It's able to be quite spontaneous, so where there's a government consultation or something that happens in the news, they can respond quite with some level of agility as a result. Some of the drawbacks are where things can be more informal. I think there's a risk that people talk but don't necessarily sign up to do actions, and that can be quite frustrating in an organisation like that. And it's a similar issue that I see across different climate groups that I've been in, actually, that often, although organisations can seem very large, it can be ultimately a very small number of people doing the bulk of the work, and that can be a problem. It can lead to burnout, and it's not sustainable ultimately. So there's been a lot of us who were previously very central to ACAN who've had to take a step away. There's a few key members who are still kind of on the steering group, keeping that legacy of original philosophy and everything going, which is really great that they've been able to sustain that. I think
and how many people are involved now?
I actually couldn't tell you. Okay. There's like international chapters across the world. I would say probably thousands of people are involved in some way or another, but I wouldn't want to put a finger on the number. Okay. But a lot. Right. And there's a tendency for them to be younger. It skews a bit young because of their way of communicating being largely through WhatsApp. So we did have some older individuals who were interested in participating who we had to email separately, and that was challenging. You know, how do you find the right communication channel for your organisation? It's actually sounds really obvious, but it's actually like really key.
Really crucial. Yeah, thank you. Thanks. That's I'm sure we could ask a lot of detailed questions about some of those logistical challenges at some point. But you know, Martha, I saw you nodding your head a bit with some of that. But you're working on a very different scale in some ways, or a different type of scale, I guess. So you've got more formal commitments, and you know, it's a global coordination amongst mayors. What can large-scale networks like C40 learn from a grassroots community and vice versa?
That is an extremely challenging question. I mean, so I guess the structure of C40, my work, I'm in a technical central team where we support cities with their climate action planning. So we work very one-on-one with cities, and the relationships we have with city officials vary hugely. Some cities we're kind of helping them write the plan. Some cities we're saying, is it done yet? Can we review? You know, like very, very different. But I think how the cities relate to each other could get a lot from more grassroots groups. So obviously C40 provides forums for them. We have a big summit linked to COP, which is a mayoral summit. You know, we have lots of accelerator technical programs cities can sign up to and officials can join. And then there's obviously networking between mayors through the C40 network. But I think that individual city officials being able to work together is incredibly powerful because, for example, in London, ULEZ has obviously hit the news. Lots of cities have their own versions, but the fact that ULEZ has surmounted all the public criticism is hugely of interest to city officials who are also worried about that, who are setting up their own. So there's a huge amount they can learn from fellow officials. So I think some of the agility you were talking about, Kat, is something that could be super helpful to kind of ensure that we're not always mediating relationships between cities, to ensure that they're creating their own relationships. But I should say I'm much more on the technical side, so that's not a recommendation I can put into place.
Well, that's interesting, relating to relationship management, even between the stakeholders. You're both saying that that's something that takes a lot of time and sort of deliberate attention. Okay.
Definitely, and I think the turnover point is really key. So with climate action planning, cities will have done their climate action plans normally around 2019, 2020, and then one of our leadership standard requirements is that they update them every 5 years. And a lot of stuff have left in that period, and often it was really initiated and carried through by passionate individuals in those cities. The mayor had to say, yes, I want to do this, but officials had to kind of carry it through. So it's now very difficult when we're in a different political climate, it's different stuff there to kind of get the same quality out or to get the same ambition out. So it's very tricky.
And an awful lot has changed since 2018, 2019. For both of you have mentioned that, so thanks. A question for Dee now, related to a quote on the First Hand website, which is wonderful and really, I feel, resonates really strongly with me. So you say, at an early point, we felt like we were pedaling so hard to hold something together which didn't really exist. It would have been so easy for it all to fall apart. What are some lessons you've learned, reflecting on that, about building communities that can sustain momentum beyond that first moment of inspiration, the excitement around being in this room like we are here, especially when these things can feel so intangible sometimes, especially in the early stages.
Very much so, and I think there's even more. I mean, the context of the work that we've done in this area has often been in response to a situation, either that we've constructed. So, you have an idea, the sequence of, I have an idea, I am going to do this, and it's in the I or we, or, how big is that group, who's making those decisions? And I think that's, particularly if you're thinking about a wider interest group, there's a real tension between who makes those decisions, who has that idea, how open can you be? Because obviously it's to your advantage to be open to bring in different perspectives, but you can only go on so long with people in a room with sandwiches. Sandwiches will only incentivize you for so long. You have to pin down some structure around it, whether that's that kind of unifying idea, galvanizing idea, or more ideally, probably a directionality that people can sign up to. But that sounds wild to some people. People don't want to sign up to a direction. They want to sign up to a thing quite often. And I would say there's a bit of a split and often a tension. So we were in a situation, so the specific example that you're talking about was a community of practice where we were convening. So, just understanding all the levers that you can put. We were convening. We issued the invitation. It wasn't people sitting down with a shared interest, having discovered that shared interest together. So the dynamic is already different. So I think understanding that dynamic, what are the power dynamics of that, who has funding, who's paid to be at the table. And I think that happens very often. Some people are paid, some people are not. Yeah. And particularly when you're dealing with university networks, there's an assumption that time is open and free. Less so probably now. I've got great sympathies with the university system right now. But I guess to the point, I think the question is always, how much structure is enough structure when? Yeah. And that will vary according to your context and vary according to who you're dealing with. Yeah. So I had a very funny story last week about community gardeners who really don't want to, I did 2 long meetings last week, one with a community gardening network, and one I attended Fix Fest, which is the community repair festival. And really interesting that there's a big dynamic of hands-on, show me the problem, I will fix it.
Yeah.
Do not talk to me about, other things that we could do while we're doing that. They don't really want to talk about, they want to solve that problem now.
The one right in front of them.
And you have to figure that one out. If that's where you are, you just have to figure it out because, that's a design challenge, effectively.
Yes.
That's your design challenge.
Yeah.
So I think that our particular situation, we needed to create a high level of trust very quickly because we were conveners. So we were trading on our position, our credentials, our background, and also being very, very considerate about our communications. What were we asking for at what moment? We weren't saying, come into this situation, we don't know what will happen. Yeah. We were saying, come to this situation, we will do this. This might help you in these ways.
Right.
And this is what we could, this is how you might benefit. So we were very careful about that. And that got us through. We were surprised by the response, and that also became effectively a prototype. That's a test.
Right.
If people will come in the door with you, that's testing your, if you see that as a design process, the amount of people who come in the room will tell you, are you asking the right questions? Yeah. Have you framed it correctly, etc. You can do it. So if no one turns up, that doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means you got that invitation wrong in some way. So I guess those were our kinds of thinking styles in the beginning.
Really interesting around sort of power, ownership, communication, and sort of ethos about what you're doing. A question to any of you now to build really on that, because you're talking about the intrinsic motivation. You all spoke about that too at the beginning. And one of the things that we discussed in our sort of preliminary phone call about this was that intrinsic motivation tends to bring people together who are more activist types rather than maybe the wider base that we actually need to sustain a movement. So what kinds of incentives, rewards, or support structures have you seen work well to keep maybe a wider range of people engaged?
Yeah, so I think in all of the groups that I've been in, there's been a combination of things. So, for instance, when working on a common goal, like for instance, writing a piece of guidance, there's often all different skills required. And quite often it's just being really clear. We need identifying who is available to you now and what's missing, and being really clear and public about what the missing ingredient is and asking for those people to come forward. So it might be that there's no one to administrate things, or it might be that there's no treasurer, or it might be that there's no graphic designer. Graphic designers are the hardest to get hold of, actually. But asking specifically to your network for people with particular skills to come forward. So maybe then that attracts people who are doers, but more quiet doers. I'm actually quite a quiet doer in the sense that I really enjoy desk-based activism. That's my bag. I really love writing really sharp letters to people, for instance, and responding to government consultations. That's lovely for me. That's my comfort area. And so being really specific about what you need. I think also the trust thing is really critical. Building trust that what you say together is kind of not necessarily confidential, but maybe won't go further than that room, and people who might be scared to say things that go against the grain feel like they can do that safely. And I think establishing some kind of house rules. Yeah. We adopted the XR house rules for hand signals and so on in the early days to help people who are less extroverted like myself to feel able to speak, and people who are really chatty Cathys like me to remember to stop talking when you've said enough, sort of thing. So that was always really helpful. And then I think also then it's celebrating successes and having some successes, allowing yourself to have some success. We spent so long in each organisation, well actually not Letty, but Architects Declare and ACAN, doing things on theory of change and working to develop our theory of change roadmap, and it was years of work to define what we thought success looked like. But along the way we were still having successes and doing things that I would say were successful, and then also reviewing when things are less successful, obviously. But for instance, if you do something and it's an achievement, making sure to pat yourselves on the back, because it can be really, if you're in pursuit of a massive goal, it can be really over time quite demoralising that big goal is still a big goal. So allowing yourself to have smaller steps along the way, and achieving those, and reminding yourselves of the journey that you've been on from A to Z or whatever. And I think also we spoke on the call about the importance of parties and joyous moments and fun, and not letting it all bog you down too much, and like having those opportunities to come together more informally to make those friendships and that trust build naturally. The people that I have collaborated with through these networks are now really close friends of mine, and we are each other's champions. And we actually have a WhatsApp group for some of us who were in the early days of ACAN, where it's called XCAN, and we basically just go to conferences and things and send each other photos when each other's been talking, or saying, wow, great effort today, or I saw that this person did this, and we're just like celebrating each other's wins. So like being each other's champions as well.
So really creating a culture is really what this is.
Yeah, I think success has breeds success, because it's daunting doing this work, feeling like, where do we begin? But as soon as you start to have traction, recognising that you're having a form of success and you're having some form of impact, helps you to have the confidence to take on bigger challenges, right? And also the more you cooperate as a group, the more you cooperate with others. Like you learn the skill of cooperating with other people who you might not always agree with about everything, to come to a common goal.
Yeah. Martha, Dee?
I would just add to that, there's something also about keeping people interested in the idea. And climate is a place where obviously there are a lot of people who believe it in the cause very fervently, but there is a kind of broader swathe of people who have become very disengaged from it, or their engagement with it has become quite nuanced and split around other things. And I think there's something about the conversation around that for climate specifically, and I think there's corollaries you can make to other topics, where people sort of turn it into, oh, well, we just have to make the positive case, and then people will be really excited about it again and want to do it. And that's always a bit dishonest, because, we're talking about climate breakdown. There's sometimes not a positive case to be made. You do just have to do it. And I think in my experience that actually a better way of looking at it is broadening the scope, rather than trying to categorize bad things and good things, or, get into the specifics of how many carbon emissions you're going to save from this versus that approach. But actually, when something like AI comes up as a challenge to the public's attention, you need to say, okay, well, how is this connected? Yeah. It's completely connected. Data centers use tons of concrete and cement and steel and energy and water and all this stuff. And that's an opportunity to broaden your networks, to kind of work with and overlap with other networks, to keep people's interest, to explain how all of these things are really connected. And I think the instinct is often to kind of drill down and focus into a specialty area, but actually that just turns people off. It means you don't stay relevant. It means you don't appear to understand that your topic is extremely broad. For example, I went to a built environment climate network event that I hadn't been to for ages recently, and I really felt like I was in 2020. I was like, this isn't very interesting, and I think there was a problem there of actually just saying the same things to the same people, rather than thinking, okay, well, how do we think about justice and war and all these different topics that are going around.
I guess what this brought to mind was we're working with UCL's Climate Action Unit the last 3 years, and Krista Mayer, who's the director there, did a terrifying presentation at the very beginning with all of 30 people in a project, and he stood up with many people in the room. I have seen a values map, just really a kind of a looking at what values people hold, why people do things, which is just a diagram of all the potential motivations, which might include money or status or power, as well as benevolence or altruism, or et cetera, et cetera. And he threw this up on a slide, and then he said, I can absolutely guarantee you that all 30 people in this room are up in this teeny tiny little, and he was like, and you were a subset of the subset up in this. And if you are not thinking about all of these different motivations, and if those are the only people that you're involved with, you have a problem, we have a problem. Yeah. And I think it's something, we've done a lot of work on market segmentation, audience segmentation, how to reach different people of different motivations. I think that's probably the biggest wake-up call that I had, in combination with, and I would recommend actually the Climate Action Unit And Chris in particular has got some great work on climate insights, but neuroscience and behavioural insights into people's response. And there's lots of work out there in terms of why people become involved, how they might be involved. And I guess it's given rise to work that we've done around what our imperfect alliances are. So that's a term that Jeannie's servant Miklos uses in terms of just that we're partnering with people with very different motivations, and we have to, which means we have to anticipate those conversations. We have to be open to those kinds of to anticipating what might satisfy that motivation when you're doing that work at the beginning to figure that out.
So I think also for a lot of people, this sort of being involved in this sort of work can be quite intimidating because they feel they're not perfect. They feel like a hypocrite because maybe they flew on a plane last week, or maybe they just ate a beef burger, or maybe they just built a massive extension with loads of glass and steel and concrete so that they could have a bigger kitchen. I think like people inherently are hypocrites, and I think coming to like accept that and try not to be non-inclusive by expecting too much of one another as individuals right now, because we're in a really difficult place where we know we need to be stepping into the next paradigm. And I think you said it when we spoke, we're kind of in today's world, but looking forward into the future paradigm shift to culture that we need to be in. And we're really hard on ourselves because we know the changes that we need to all make, but it's really difficult to make those changes individually. And that's why we need to come together. And although what you just said is we're a very small number of a very small number, actually the vast majority of the British public want us to do something about climate change. The vast majority of people are good inherently and want to look out for each other. But unfortunately, the system is built in a way where inequalities are very deep right now, and people don't necessarily trust one another, and there's a lot of fundamental issues to overcome. And I think it's being aware of those challenges, but also those opportunities that generally people are good, generally people have in conversation with one another, respect for one another, even if online it seems otherwise. So I think there's reason to have hope there, but it is a communications challenge. I think, like David Attenborough has said, this is a communications challenge now. And it's just being careful to not become a silo through being too perfectionist and too high in your expectations of yourselves and one another, and using language that can be intimidating and so on, and try and be as inclusive and welcoming as you can be to anyone, no matter where they are on their own personal journey. Like, you don't have to be a vegan to be a member, like you don't have to cycle to work to be a member, although maybe you feel supported in the journey to making some different personal choices in your life. Actually, we know that those individual choices are very big together, added up, but actually very small in comparison to the impacts of fossil fuel companies and of the billionaires who have power. So I think we have to remind ourselves we individually have some level of agency and we can all make improvements. We're so much stronger working together.
So we have a couple pieces of advice. Don't be so hard on yourself. Figure out, understand motivations. Martha, before I turn it over to the audience, any advice from you? Sort of last words of advice as we're...
I think that same point that I made about connecting with other issues. I think partly also from, I don't know, I guess like when I was a teenager, I was like the green kid, like I liked being in green club at school or whatever. And it can't work like that anymore. It can't just be there are green people, there are people whose issue is this and that. Like they are all very connected. The tools you need to use to tackle them are connected, if not the root causes of the issues. And the ways you might tackle them. So I think it's about alliances and thinking really politically and really broadly about what it is you're trying to achieve with your project.
Excellent. Thank you. So we'd like now to open it up to the rest of the audience for questions. It could be a question for anyone in particular or to the panel as a whole. And we do have a roving mic, which Mary has. So if you have a question, thank you for the recordings. So the question is, how can a person who might feel strongly inclined to be working towards global responsibility but doesn't necessarily feel supported in their workplace to do so, how can they derive some agency or motivation or support in order to do that, to act on that?
So as part of First Stand, we've recently run a cross-mentoring program, which we trialled. I think in our kind of obligations under the work that we committed to do, there was a mentoring program with the idea that senior people in the industry would mentor new entrants. And we rejected that as an idea and designed a program which was about cross-mentoring. So an exchange between early career and later career. Not necessarily sustainability professionals, but sustainability interested people who came from, we did a cross-sectional, we had 12 people, 6 early career, 6 later career, and I think what really struck us was how similar they all felt. So those early career people were looking up saying, where's the action, where's the senior, they weren't senior, it wasn't necessarily that, but very, very, very embedded, very experienced people similarly felt that the world was changing around them and they didn't have purchase and they didn't have agency, and that their commitments and responsibilities kept them in business as usual. So I think just the articulation of that gave them all a bit more permission, and they came out feeling, now that's a feeling rather than necessarily an action. We focused in that context, we focused on transversal skills or soft skills. So really figuring out how you could be strategic about your communications, how you could partner and collaborate both internally and externally, and how you could initiate action in a way due to the kind of influences you were able to exert. So really kind of, we took a skills lens with an idea that those skills, just through action, they would discover that confidence, and that they potentially had the means to do that internally. And that doesn't apply across the board. That's just the experience that we had. And we certainly had incredible feedback from both sides. But just that visibility of the questions each of them were asking in their context, and then some idea of the skills or approaches they could, seem to work very well for them. That's a very specific example.
I mean, this is not disconnected from what Dee's just said, but internal networks can be super powerful at work. I used to work for an engineering firm when I was a graduate engineer, and in the wake of 2020, we saw, all our colleagues and our senior colleagues going marching and joining ACAN or whatever, and then not much happening in the way of what the company was actually doing. And so we just built a network and an internal pressure group. And I say just, it was actually very stressful and scary to stand up in front of your seniors and say you've built this network and you want to try and persuade them to do more. But it was a really powerful thing, and it's something that has stayed with me in all the places I've worked since there, whether a kind of formal network like that one or informally working out who my allies at work are, who I can work with and get advice from or support from if there's something I think we should be doing more on. And I think that there's a lot you can learn from unions in that regard. My union at work is quite topic focused, so we do quite a lot of saying, why is the organisation not doing more on this or that, and kind of coming up with arguments. Some unions are much more kind of HR-y focused, and that's not so relevant, but the same processes and systems, I think, can really apply. And I think if you come to your own organisation in good faith and say, you've made this climate target or whatever target, we want to help you get there, and if they know that that's you're coming to that with good intentions, I think they can be very, very powerful things.
Yeah, and I think also global responsibility can be taken at literally any scale. Like any decision that you make has some form of global responsibility, doesn't it? It's just the scale of that global responsibility. So even if you have a very small amount of agency at work, you can work within the bounds of that very small amount of agency. Like an example was at my former practice where I was head of sustainability, had conversations with the communications person who was really disappointed. They just built a brand new website for the company, and then they received an email to say, oh, actually the carbon emissions of your website are really high because you've got videos and very high res images, and actually we could look to optimize it. And they were really disappointed. But that's like a really small but tangible thing that she could then go away and think about, how do we, and that's small, but it's an actionable thing, and it has some form of global responsibility within the bounds of her day job, and it's not that challenging to enact change. So I think it's like finding those little wins that give you some level of success and satisfaction, and maybe the alliance forming thing. But then ultimately, I had a lecture from someone from the Cambridge Institute of Sustainable Leadership, and she said that her advice to her students doing their master's programme for people working in practice in professional roles is know when the time to quit is. If you feel like you're not being listened to, if you feel like you've done all you can to make change in your role, or if you feel like you're not supported, consider your options. Would you prefer to work in an organisation where you would be listened to, where your insight would be valued, and where you would have more potential to feel more ethical alignment? with your own value system. I think that's a really important thing to remember. And then when you leave, make sure to make it clear that that's one of the motivating factors for your departure, because you leaving might be a really good lesson for the organisation that you felt was so disappointing.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions? John.
Thanks. Really interesting. You've obviously got lots of experience between you, lots of networks that are trying to achieve things. Where would be a gap you think we should be looking to fill?
So the question is, what is a gap that this systems change lab could fill based on your experience of sort of understanding this space and what networks are out there?
For me personally, I think there's a real gap at the community level. I think professionals working in engineering, architecture, built environment really understand climate change and really understand it at a very theoretical level, at a high level, in a practical sense. I'm now putting more energy at a community level, so I'm currently campaigning to save an oak tree in my town. And that sounds really small, but it's ended up evoking really complicated feelings and interconnected issues, and it's highlighted a really big nationwide issue around how insurance companies basically are very easily nudging trees being felled all over the country because it's the cheapest course of action. And I think one area of potential is for professionals like us to use our skills to support more local based campaign issues in the places that we live. The next thing I want to turn my attention to, regardless of the outcome for my favoured oak tree, is to start working on looking at restoring the local river where I live, which actually you walked up last weekend. It's filled with poo and flotsam and rubbish, and it's also a really interesting kind of beautiful place with scientifically outstanding natural habitat, and I think realising that your skill set can extend way beyond your day job is really also worth thinking about, and speaking to people who don't necessarily have your skills and knowledge and trying to impart that in a really non-patronising, empowering way can have a huge multiplier effect, I think.
Yeah, and I think similarly connecting community groups and existing community groups with resources is a huge gap. So I'm on my neighbourhood WhatsApp group, and it's lovely and infuriating and hilarious every single day. And lots of people there really care about stuff that I care about. And I used to work at the Greater London Authority, and so I was aware of all these kind of tools and resources that were there. And there was just no way as a community group that we could access those things or learn about retrofit coordinators or think through the idea that actually if all of us wanted to retrofit our homes, we could do it more cheaply if we bought heat pumps together, or those of us who are tenants could work together to write letters to the same landlord if they're the same landlord. So I think there's a real gap in terms of connecting existing community networks and community groups, because there are so many of them and they're so long-standing and they know themselves and each other so well, and connecting those to all the things that as professionals we work on every day. I think that is an absolutely enormous gap. And I think there's a lot of energy that goes into building a new stakeholder engagement mechanism and network and all this stuff. And actually we should be saying that church has a congregation of 1,000 people and they all really care about X, Y, Z. Should we not try and work with them instead?
I'm kind of staring into space and thinking, gaps. And I don't know if this is going to come out right, but I was chatting this morning to someone about the World Design Congress that's on at the moment, and they were asking why I was coming here and not going there. And I was like, I'll be furious all day. And they were asking me, why would you be furious? And to me at the moment, it's a design for planet. There's some amazing people speaking. It's fantastic. But there's something about it that just assumes business as usual to me, that either we're very nature connected, but everything else is kind of fine, or we're, there's incredible innovative materials and we've solutioneered our way out of it and everything else is the same. So it never feels like it never feels satisfying in terms of a conversation. I always feel like it's not grasping the nettle, And it's all within the confines of how design sells its services and how it's structured and what those skills look like and how they're delivered. And so all the teams look this. There seems to be some underlying assumptions that it never takes on. And I think, to me, that would be the interesting gap. It's the kind of the day after collapse, as these things, and I don't believe there's a day after collapse. I believe there's an unraveling which is happening already. But that unraveling unravels a lot. It unravels the way that we work, the way we organize ourselves, the way whatever. And I feel like there's very few people who sit in between the kind of the IPCC level and perhaps even disciplinary lead, conversations which are saying we need to be thinking about this. And then the NGOs who are mopping up, all of the thinking, but at a certain scale. And I feel like that kind of quite practical, kind of what might those scenarios look like? How might engineering services be delivered in these contexts? Like, to really kind of dig in something more specific than these kind of general observations. I think that's where I'd love to hear a cross-disciplinary or cross-sectoral conversation that has credibility or has power or a bit more weight to it. Maybe?
Thank you. Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. If there's, okay, I'm sorry, Tim, I'm going to go to the back of the room.
Hi, there you go, you can hear me, great. I was going to say, it's been fantastic to listen to you today. You've all obviously been attracted and motivated to a career where you've been able to commit a lot of time and you have great purpose and you've affected change very positively. If you think about the context, if you're addressing kind of the next generation, younger people, they're looking at their education options, their employment options, how might you inspire and engage people to pursue engineering and make that link with global challenges? And then secondly, how can you make engineering as a field more welcoming and inclusive for people that might be neutral or on the fence about saying, am I welcome? Could this be something for me to commit time, money, career, finances towards? How, in your experience, would you make a recommendation to a young person or even to the gatekeepers, that maybe influence how people might engage and participate in engineering?
Okay, so two questions there. One around how do you connect engineering more closely to these questions of global responsibility, sort of more broadly, and then how do you then translate that into attracting more diverse people into the profession?
I love this question because I studied engineering because I wanted to work on climate. I did civil and structural engineering, and I used to be really passionate about women engineering and all this stuff. I did my degree, I learned how to design in concrete and steel, then I got into the workplace and realised I did not want to do anything that had anything to do with concrete and steel. And I made a really conscious decision when I was like 4 years into having practiced it as an engineer that I just didn't want to be an engineer anymore. I didn't want to design in concrete and steel, and I couldn't make a living as an engineer by not doing that, or it was just really exhausting working at a practice where I was constantly having to kind of fight to avoid those projects. So I made a really conscious decision that I wasn't going to bother getting chartership and I was going to leave and I was going to work in policy instead to try and change the conditions that engineers operate in rather than just, like having these exhausting battles about what projects we were doing. And actually, even just like speaking with colleagues at Engineers Without Borders has made me feel quite, I don't know, I guess a bit more like maybe I am still an engineer. I just do something quite different. Like I spend my day looking at, models about what policy impacts have and how they line up to targets and taking a more lateral view about what engineering can be. And I don't think I'm particularly interested in going back and now trying to get a chartership. But I guess to me, it's maybe about, genuinely broadening what it means to be an engineer and like maybe you can just self-define as an engineer if you feel like you're an engineer. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but I guess I was someone who felt very disillusioned with my engineering education and the whole field. So I just gave up on it. But maybe the solution is actually to be like, some engineering could be totally different now. It could be talking to cities every day and, building some cool spreadsheets or something. I don't know.
I could have been an engineer because at Nottingham they did this dual certification pathway. You can study for being architect on that pathway alongside becoming an engineer, and quite a lot of people that I know now in this world did that. And so I slightly have a tinge of regret for not having done the engineering year, because it was only 1 year additionally. And actually in my role now, I mostly seem to engage a lot with engineers because they provide technical information for planning applications that I'm responsible for reviewing. And my God, it would be so good to be able to be like, hey, I'm an engineer too. Because at the moment, all I can say is, hey, I'm an architect too. I'm not just, people have this perception about planners that we don't really know an awful lot. So I have to sometimes really lay it on thick that I know quite a bit, which feels really annoying. And to be honest, like the engineers are the people that I prefer to engage with in my role now, because they react to my questions or my comments really professionally and with respect. I can't say the same for everyone that engages with me day to day. I've had some really quite uncomfortable experiences, mostly with men, actually, like quite sexist, and that's been quite a shock to me working in this role. So I'd say for me now, looking back, engineering would have helped me on my career that I'm in now, but also not being an engineer hasn't stopped me from along the way doing additional courses and things that are of an engineering persuasion. So passive house training courses, or doing building physics modules. Like, I think in a way, if there was an ability to do more bite-size engineering type education throughout the career, and not necessarily with a view to certification. I feel like certification in a way is a bit frustrating, isn't it? Because we're in a climate emergency, we're in a time of social justice emergency. Like, do we have time to be like getting all the certificates and the letters after our names? Or is it more about us making sure that we actually know what we're talking about and who to talk to if we don't know what we're talking about, and where to look for that information? And I feel like there's a lot of concepts coming to the fore at the moment that are really challenging and complicated. And I think engineers have a great power to communicate better. For instance, the difference between an exhaust air heat pump versus an air source heat pump, and the impact of choosing one system on another, the role of district heat networks. It's so complicated and difficult from like a policy planning perspective to keep pace with all the change that's coming. And I think engineers are really well placed to communicate that. But at the moment, unfortunately, quite a lot of what I see is kind of quite poor communication of technically quite complicated things that I then have to explain to case officers and so on. So I think there's stuff around there about engineers have an amazing skill set, but I think perhaps if you learn to communicate what you know a bit better, that would be really helpful. And explaining things in simple terms, and explaining where something is an advantage at a building level versus at a city level, and trying to come to points of consensus on that would be really helpful. So yeah, that's an ask for you. I don't know if that really answers the question at all.
Well, as a person with a PhD in literature who works in engineering, I could not agree with you more on the importance of communication. Dee, anything to add to that one before we wrap up?
I could just take the rest of the afternoon to talk about the education system, because we've worked a lot with schools, we've worked a lot with FE colleges and HE, right the way through in design and engineering, and broadly STEM, and primary, and then into the qualification-dominated secondary and school system. So I have views, but they're really boring, and so I'll just take 2 minutes to talk about fixed camp, because that was you said, how do you engage people with young people with engineering in a way which is relevant. It's one of the best projects I've ever done. I still smile when I think about it, and everything in 3 week kids activity camp that'll be ran in Brixton 2018 under Royal Academy of Engineering and Genius funding. Yeah. The deadline is it's 25th of September. If anyone's got any brilliant engineering engagement projects, you should just get in there and apply, because they were a brilliant funder, and it was just a gift to be able to. We'd been working in the school system a lot, and we were trapped by the subject structures and the curriculum, and we broke out and did a summer camp which combined anything from whittling to laser cutting. The kids made their own tools and then used their own tools. On Monday they fixed housing. On Tuesday they fixed transport. On Wednesday they fixed education, which they really like. Friday they fixed fun, which was really interesting. And they had to come in with big solutions and build them. And they did it with everything from cardboard sticks to laser cutting and weird plastics and you name it. And it was a joy, and it's absolutely possible with project-based learning and place-based approaches. It's infinitely possible. The whole school system is constrained. There's amazing non-formal learning providers out there who are providing enrichment. And if any of you have companies or organizations who could support any of those non-formal learning projects, I encourage you to, because we worked with STEM ambassadors as well. And the STEM ambassador program is absolutely fantastic in professional support for that type of engagement. And having those professionals come in, I still think about, there's a woman, local woman from Brixton, a black woman who'd gone up to run a brewery in Scotland in the 1980s, who told us about being a brewery engineer. It's so vivid. So there's lots of ways to do it. It's limited within the existing education structures, and you can get quite exhausted, which is why I'm working with grown-ups now. But, the subject is amazing, and there's lots and lots of ways to engage young people in ways which are incredibly relevant and exciting. You just have to find those chinks and keep going.
Well, that's marvelous. Dee, Martha, and Kat, thank you so much for your insights. This has been incredibly valuable, and I think will really inform not only what we're going to do in the rest of the afternoon, but in our months and years ahead with the Systems Change Lab. So can you join me in thanking our panelists?